Okay, everyone, welcome to our first module in our Intro to Neurotech course. This is part one of neuroscience. It's intended to be a primer of mainly the structure, function, and anatomy of the brain. We'll get into cellular functions and a little bit at the molecular and neuronal level in the next module. Before I go into the content for today, like about the parts of the brain and the relevant functions, I wanted to take some time and talk about neurotechnology as a whole. Um, this was talked about in the first meeting, if for those of you watching who came to our first meeting, but we realized that not everyone could attend. And so we first wanted to just give a background and introduction into what neurotechnology is, what it lets us do, and hopefully that can help contextualize why we're teaching the material that we're teaching in this course in order for you to better understand and get the skills into developing neuro interfaces. Um, so neurotechnology is inherently interdisciplinary. It's the combination of brain sciences, which is psychology, neuroscience, and cognitive science, and that in combination with technology and engineering principles as well. So there's so many different aspects of it. Like you have obviously all the brain sciences, but then you also have aspects of mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, computer science, and BME to a certain extent. And so the basic idea of neurotechnology is developing a device that can interface between itself and the nervous system. And so there are two aspects of the nervous system. There's a central nervous system, which is basically your brain and your spinal cord. And then there's the peripheral nervous system, which is any sort of sensory organs or sensory information, sensory receptors, and the routes and channels they take through the spinal cord and ultimately up to your brain. And so there are three facets of neurotechnology. The first one is in understanding the brain. So currently, relative to the other parts of the body and other systems in the body, we probably understand the least information about the brain. And that's partly due to because we don't have the technology and the appropriate skills or the appropriate tools to look into the brain and figure out what we need to know. And so a lot of tools that are being used today that you guys might be familiar with are EEGs, MRIs, fMRIs, and PET scans, which you've all probably heard of before. These are tools and imaging techniques that we use to understand the brain, and they help us analyze the brain at multiple different levels. So for example, EEGs analyze potentials and electrical signals in the brain, whereas MRIs and fMRIs analyze blood flow to certain regions. And so they look at different things and they tell us different things about the brain, but we can use neurotechnology to understand more about the brain and why it's doing exactly what it's doing. The most recent development in this area has been something called optogenetics, which is basically the use of UV lights to activate certain neurons in the brain. So we can literally turn off and on certain neurons by just shining a light on the brain. The second area of neurotechnology is restoring brain functions. So a lot of neuropsychiatric disorders and neurological disorders, although we don't know too much about them, the most common factor across all of them are associated with low levels of activity in the respective regions of their brain. And currently, all the drug development that's been going on and all the treatments that we have so far make use of changing the brain at the chemical level and working with neurotransmitters to, I guess, deplete or replenish them or allow for like more reuptake. And what that does is that prevents, first of all, that can't be targeted in certain parts of the brain where necessary. So it affects a large region more than we need, and that induces certain side effects that are unwanted. But with neurotechnology, we can target certain areas of the brain and stimulate them using electrical impulses or other forms of modulations, where we can deliver specific treatment. And because it's not inducing any chemicals or any chemicals that are foreign to the brain, we're not leaving those unintended side effects and causing more problems as we go along. The third aspect to neurotechnology is augmenting the brain. So This refers to giving the brain external capacities that is not available in its organic form. And this is probably the coolest part of neurotechnology, and this is where brain-computer interfaces come in, because we are trying to interface the brain or our nervous system with any technological device. And that technological device can be a mouse, it can be a keyboard, it can be a computer, a car, anything that's technologically able to process signals at the end of the day. Because if you think about it, the brain is just an organ that produces electrical signals. So if we can find some way to record that, analyze it, and interpret it, and we can feed that into any other machine that takes in electrical signals, we have a brain-computer interface. So a little bit about the course. This course is just meant to be an intro to neurotechnology. Our basic objective of this is to establish a common baseline and give all the necessary information that you would need to know in order to understand what neurotechnology is all about, and also be able to build and work on projects revolving around brain-computer interfaces. So we plan to cover everything from the anatomy and function of the brain, brain imaging techniques, signal processing, signal extraction, and how to work with that data and ultimately transform that into a usable format which you can use to interface with any other piece of technology. Because of this whole online thing with the virus, we plan to make pre-recorded modules and release them on a weekly basis, and also have sort of like weekly progress checks in the form of Google Forms, where you'll just answer questions based on your understanding. And if you have any questions related to the content, or if you have any questions in general, we'll also have a Google form that you can fill out and submit, and one of us will be in touch with you to answer any other questions that you might have. This is tentative right now, and it might change, but this is our plan for right now. Okay, so jumping into the content for today. So we have the brain, and first I want to talk about its relevance. So like, why is it relevant to know about the brain and like how it functions and all the anatomy part of it? Well, because if you're making a system that is called a brain-computer interface, and you're trying to make a device that interacts with the brain and the nervous system, it's important to invest some time into knowing how the brain works and how it processes, because, I mean, in order to engineer a system, you need to understand how the system works in the first place. So here are just a couple of fun facts. The brain has 100 billion neurons, and that's a lot of neurons. And more than that, we have trillions of synapses. So each neuron is connected to other neurons in the form of a synapse. And if we have trillions of synapses and billions of neurons, then no brain would be identical, because the amount of combinations are just insane. Also, the brain takes up 20% of the body's oxygen, and you can see how the brain is pretty resource-intensive organ, but it's also doing a lot of the work. So it makes sense. As far as, this was surprising to me when I first learned about this, but the brain's 60% fat. And there's something called the myelin sheath, which actually is a layer of fat that coats neurons, or coats the axon terminals of neurons, and helps conduct signals at a faster pace. And we'll cover this more on module 2. But when you hear about gray matter versus white matter, the white matter is associated with fat. And the brain in general is about 3 pounds, and it's just like a gelatinous substance. If any of you ever get a chance to hold a brain during a dissection and you feel it, it's usually hard because of how it's preserved. But a brain in general is very gelatinous in texture, and it's actually very hard to identify the key structures in the brain when you first look at it. So when you look at the organ, there are multiple angles at which you could look at the brain. So I just want to go over some terminology and some angles through which are commonly used when you study the brain. So starting from the left, you have the dorsal view. And the dorsal view is kind of like a bird's eye view of the brain from the top down. And you have the frontal lobe and the occipital lobe at the back, and the parietal lobe right in the center, right kind of in the center of the brain. And we'll get into what these lobes or why these lobes are important and what their functions are later in this module. But this is just to kind of orient yourself when you look at other pictures as well. So on your right, you have the ventral view, and that's kind of like from the bottom up. So as if you're like standing underneath the brain and looking at it upwards like that. And again, I just labeled the frontal lobes to kind of orient yourself, so you know where from what angle you're looking at. The two other structures you see here called the temporal lobe and the cerebellum, we'll also get into that, but those are structures that you wouldn't be able to see or decipher if you were looking at it from the dorsal view. So similarly, we also have the lateral and the medial views. So these are views from the side, they're cross sections of the brain. So over here you have the lateral view, and that's kind of like from the outside in of the brain. This is arguably the most common view when you look on Google Images, or when you draw a brain, you usually draw it from the side and from the outside specifically. And that's because you can see a lot of the lobes, in fact, all four lobes, along with the cerebellum and the brainstem. And this is the medial view. This is again like a cross section, except if you imagine the two brains like the two hemispheres, and if you just cut it straight in half, this is kind of like the inside version of the organ. Okay, so now let's go on to the reptilian brain. So when you look at the brain in general, a lot of, like, we're not the only organisms or species that have brains, right? Like, there are a lot of organisms that have brains, even like an earthworm, starting from the most primitive of species. And all our brains have certain similarities between certain similarities and certain differences that correspond to our unique abilities as species. And so the reptilian brain is associated with reptiles from an evolutionary perspective. And this is the most primitive region of the brain. It's responsible for instincts, for reflexes, for just keeping us alive and keeping our bodily rhythms. And it's associated with the back and lower part of the brain. So you'll decipher this pattern as we learn more, but the higher and the more forward you come in the brain is responsible for newer developments and associated with newer abilities in terms of consciousness, intelligence, and overall abilities as a species. So that's why from primates to humans, our skulls, our brain capacities grew bigger. And they're associated with more layers and layers of cortex, and that corresponds to higher functions as a species. So we're going to start off with the most primitive sections, the reptilian brain, and build upwards. So starting with the base right here is the medulla oblongata. So as you can see, it's the part that's right above the spinal cord. So if you were to imagine the continuation, the spinal cord would be down here. And the medulla oblongata is practically the first part of the brain that connects right there. And it's involved in regulating involuntary functions. So your heart rate, breathing, digestion, they're all involuntary and they're all internal. And the medulla oblongata plays a key role in regulating those processes. It's also responsible for reflexes. So sneezing, regurgitating, any sort of defense mechanism in your body is part of that too. Next up, you have the pons. So the pons is right above the medulla oblongata, and it's responsible in regulating breathing rates. And also it relays signals between the cerebellum and the cerebrum. So the cerebellum is this little structure right here that you see under the brain. The cerebellum actually translates to little brain, so that can help you remember where the cerebellum is. And the cerebrum is basically the rest of the brain. And so the pons is the middleman in terms of relaying signals between the newer part of the brain to the more primitive sections. Next up, you have the midbrain. And the midbrain is associated with motor reflexes, with visual and auditory stimuli. So compared to the medulla oblongata, that's also responsible for reflexes like sneezing and regurgitation, these are more motor reflexes, especially with visual and auditory stimuli. So when you hear something that's super loud and you kind of like shrink back in fear, or you just kind of flinch, that's a motor reflex associated with auditory stimuli. And if you saw something coming at you and you turned your face away, or you shielded your face, or you ducked, those are again motor reflexes associated with visual stimuli. So so the midbrain plays a role in motor control and motor reflexes. Then you have the cerebellum, And the cerebellum is responsible for voluntary movements and balance and coordination. So you can think of it as having an internal model of how your body moves. So it automatically has an intuitive model for friction, resistance, gravity, all of those things that kind of help you balance and orient yourself is part of the cerebellum. And just a fun fact, it has 50% of the neurons in our brain. So as you can see, all the structures that we covered, they're very like primitive in nature, and they account for a lot of functions in our body that we don't even think about on a daily basis. And if we had damage to these areas, we most likely would suffer life-threatening injuries, and they could possibly be fatal because they're so integral to our body and are so important in our daily functions and just keeping us alive that we often don't even notice it, but any damage to that would probably be fatal. The next part of the brain that we'll move on to is the mammalian part. And so the mammalian part of the brain is credited with giving that emotional complexity and depth in terms of memory, emotions, and heightened senses and perceptions. So that's also a key reason why we probably feel more connected with mammals in general than reptiles, because our brains to a certain extent have similar processes, and they're more developed and have more corresponding areas of higher functions. So for example, your dog, cat, even livestock like chickens, not chickens, I mean sheep and horses, we like, when they say that animals have a sixth sense and they know what's going on, that part of the brain is that's responsible for those kinds of things is the emotional area and the limbic system, which we'll get into. And reptiles don't have those structures that are as developed. So a big factor in this area of the brain is called the thalamus. And the thalamus quite literally sits dead in the center of the brain, and it's the brain's official middleman. So any sort of sensory information that you are getting, whether it be from your eyes or your ears or any sort of smell, it first enters through those pathways and goes to the thalamus. It makes a pit stop at the thalamus essentially, and then gets routed to the appropriate areas of where it's supposed to get processed in the brain. So for example, if I'm seeing something, light is coming in through my retina, and the retina right here is like, this is the front of the brain, so your eyes are right under it. Light comes in through the retina, goes through the thalamus, and then goes into the visual cortex towards the back of the brain where visual information gets processed. Another key important structure in this part of the brain is called the hippocampus. The hippocampus is associated with memory, and more specifically, it's associated with the encoding and retrieval of long-term memory. So it's not exactly a storage space per se, like memories aren't stored there, but when you are experiencing something or learning something, the part of your brain that is storing all that information and making it accessible for you to remember later is called the hippocampus. And naturally, damage to this part of the region leads to problems with memory, more specifically amnesia. There are two kinds of amnesia. One is retrograde amnesia. Retrograde amnesia is the inability to recall the past. So let's say you're living your life normally, and then up until the day that you have an accident or this traumatic brain injury occurs, from that moment on, you basically don't remember anything up until that point. And so you basically start new, you have to learn, you forget people, you forget facts, information, anything about yourself. There's also the opposite of that, which is called anterograde amnesia. Anterograde amnesia is the inability to make new memories. So you're basically stuck in the past, and every day that you wake up is a new day for you. So these conditions are pretty devastating, and they have lifelong implications. And a lot of this has been learned with damage done to people's brains accidentally. And we just kind of study the effects it has on these people. Now we go to the new brain, and it's called the new brain because it it's, first of all, it's relatively new in terms of evolutionary history, and it's what distinguishes us and primates between other mammals. So to a certain extent, this part of the brain is what's responsible for making us uniquely human and giving us those capabilities that, say, other animals will not have. So in this diagram, as you can see right here, just to reiterate, you have the reptilian brain right here, right, the lower primitive regions, and the mammalian brain would be this middle section right here that consists of the thalamus, the hippocampus, and what we call the limbic system, which isn't even clearly defined yet by many scientists, but it's basically responsible for emotional processing. And then surrounding all of that is the cerebral cortex. That's just a layer of nerves, of neurons just packed together, and that's responsible for, there are a lot of networks in that layer, and it's responsible for giving rise to perception, attention, planning, and even our identity and personality. Like that's where the human element of the brain resides, arguably. So going back to the anatomy as a whole, when I was showing you pictures of the dorsal and the ventral regions of the brain, I had labeled all the lobes, and here are what the lobes mean and what functions they're responsible for in the brain. So starting with the frontal lobe, as the name suggests, it's at the front of the brain. So this would be your forehead. This would be your forehead right here, and your eyes would be right here. And it's responsible for thinking, planning, and decision making. So we call these executive functions, and they allow us to kind of make a hierarchy of our goals, our plans, and think in the big picture of things, and be able to understand our day-to-day interactions, and kind of I guess abstract away from like us as individuals and us in society. You also have the parietal lobe, which is right next to it, kind of on the top part of your head right here, and that's responsible for sensation and perception and spatial processing in general. One thing that's also in this kind of region of the brain are the somatosensory cortex and the motor cortex, and they're kind of right between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. And they're responsible for, again, like movement. The motor cortex is responsible for movement, and somatosensory is responsible for any sort of sensation that you receive from parts of your body in general. And they're situated in this area, and that makes sense because your parietal lobe is responsible for spatial awareness and sensations, and so those connections are, the cortices being located in those areas make sense, and they play important roles with each other. So now you have the occipital lobe, and the occipital lobe is in the back of the head, and that the main function of the occipital lobe is just visual processing. There's actually a lot that goes on in here, and in fact, it's the most studied part of the brain. There's extensive data and studies done in this region of the brain, and so we know a lot about the visual system, specifically the mammalian visual system. And then you also have the temporal lobes, and the temporal lobes are responsible for auditory processing and language comprehension. So now we have the visual processing in the brain, and so I just wanted to highlight this processing in general because visual processing is the most studied in the brain, and we know a lot about it, and a lot of key insights into how functions or how things get processed in the brain come from the visual system. So it's just something to think about when going further. So like I said earlier, when something is in your visual field, light at a fundamental level, light is entering your retina, and then it gets routed through the thalamus, like we talked about earlier, the middleman of the brain. And then it goes into the visual cortex, and the visual cortex is in the occipital lobe. So the visual cortex is subdivided into 5 areas, V1 through V5. And V1 and V2 are associated with low-level processing, like shapes and orientation of whatever you're seeing. So, for example, if I'm seeing a textbook right in front of me, I know it's a book and I know that I use it to study, but at a fundamental level, all I'm all the textbook is a bunch of lines in a certain pattern. So I'm seeing horizontal lines, I'm seeing vertical lines, and I'm seeing a certain color. And so V1 and V2 process all of these low, like fundamental details. V4 and V5 are used to integrate these features into an object. So so when I see a vertical line and a horizontal line in a certain pattern forming a certain shape, I use that information to deduce that it is a textbook given my experiences that I've had earlier. And so at a fundamental level, that's how we visually process things. But this kind of this idea of processing, this theory of processing also extends to other regions of the brain, such as the auditory cortex. And that is also labeled and that is also subdivided and labeled in a similar format. So along with that, there are two streams of visual processing. First off, we have the ventral pathway. If you remember earlier, the ventral perspective of the ventral view of the brain was from the bottom up. And so ventral kind of signifies a downward bottom pathway. That's why you see the arrow going down in the brain. And this pathway is responsible for object recognition. And it's often called the what stream. And so when you look at an object and you're trying to recognize what it is, classify it into a category, or group it with similar objects, you are using the ventral pathway in visual perception. Also, color is processed in this pathway. And then you also have the dorsal pathway. The dorsal pathway is responsible, or first off, it's called the where/how pathway, and it's responsible for telling you where an object is relative to other objects and relative to you in a three-dimensional setting. And the how corresponds to how would you interact with an object, like how would you reach for it, what are objects that are close to it, and if you had to do anything to the object, how would you interact with it. And so this is called a dorsal stream, or this is part of the dorsal stream because as I said, dorsal goes upwards, and the dorsal of the occipital lobe is the parietal lobe, and that's responsible for spatial awareness. So if you think about it, it makes sense that if you're trying to figure out an object's spatial relativity to you and how would you interact with it, you would use part of your parietal lobe, and that would basically make a dorsal stream of visual processing. Another key feature of the brain is the somatosensory and the motor cortex. So we talked about this briefly earlier. It's situated between the frontal and the parietal lobes. Just take a moment to look at this diagram right here. This map, so to speak, as you're seeing, was actually generated by a scientist of the name Penfield. And Penfield basically used electrodes to stimulate certain regions of the brain, and then he would ask his subjects where they're feeling their sensations. And then he was able to generate this map of corresponding regions. One key thing to notice is that different parts of the cortex map to different parts of the body. So and with that being said, more sensitive regions take up more areas of the cortex. So for example, if you see at the somatosensory cortex, we start with the lips and the eyes and then go over to the hands, and that already takes up almost half the cortex. And that makes sense because we're the most sensitive in those regions. Our face and our hands are the most sensitive parts in being able to sense any sort of movement or touch reception on our limbs and our extremities. And so the size of how sensitive a region is corresponds to a bigger area on the cortex. Another cool and interesting thing with these cortices is that missing limbs or missing areas of the body kind of tend to make their way into or tend to be encroached upon by adjacent areas of the cortex. So for example, in amputees that lose their feet and their toes, if you see the somatosensory cortex, you see that the feet are really close to the genitals in the cortex. So people who lose their feet experience phantom sensations in their genitals, and for a while that was really confusing for a lot of people, because they were feeling sensations in a part of their body that was so far off from where it was physically, or where it was supposed to be physically. But looking at this map that was made of the cortex, it makes sense why that would happen, and it gave us a better idea of why we feel such weird sensations, especially when we lose certain parts of our bodies. Now to recap as the brain as a whole, I talked a lot about all these individual structures and individual parts of the brain, but I want to emphasize that no part of the brain is responsible for just one particular function. Like, these areas of the brain are not mutually exclusive in their functions, and the brain is actually more of like an amalgamation of all of these processes and all of these structures. But that's to say that the brain is not just a mere sum of its parts. Like, you can't just take these structures and basically add them, and that gives you a brain. The brain has a lot of networks that are going from all different kinds of areas and all different kinds of structures. And so that's why the brain is best understood as an integration of all these areas. And while these areas are not mutually exclusive, that's their primary function from what we know so far. With that being said, also, the brain is an extremely plastic organ. And you guys have all probably heard this before, but just, I guess, to put this into context, compared to other organs like your heart or your lungs, from the day you're born to the day you die, those organs, like your heart and lungs, primarily function the same way. They'll change because of age, and they'll grow weaker, and they won't be as efficient, but that's a consequence of aging. But they're not changing they're not changing in a fundamental way. Your brain, however, is constantly rewiring itself. It's making new associations depending on what you're learning, depending on your life experiences, new associations with other neurons, with other networks. It's constantly changing. It's plastic, so it keeps changing, and that's why it's so different. And it's also very hard to understand because nothing's really constant. There are also different aspects to analyzing the brain. Like I said earlier, we can analyze it at a cellular level using single unit recording, and that's when you actually stick like needle-sized electrodes into the brain and record like one specific neuron. You can do it at a tissue level and look at fMRI, and you can look at blood flowing in and out of regions of the brain. You can also study populations of neurons, like groups of neurons, and look at their electrical activity and record that from the scalp. And you can also analyze it at the systems level. And there are a lot of studies that are being done with a combination of all these different things, just to understand how the brain works. So that concludes our first module. This was just a primer onto the anatomy and the basic parts about the brain. Module 2 will be more focused on the internal cellular and molecular functions of the brain, so neurons, parts of a neuron, how they fire, and stuff like that, and Mateo will be doing that. Here are some relevant links on the last slide about our website, our Facebook group, or our email. If you're not on our Facebook group, please join that. And if you have any questions, feel free to email us at that email. We will be posting a Google form along with this for any questions specific to this module. So if you have any, feel free to hit that up. And also be sure to complete the questionnaire on your understanding of this material so far.